so we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 6 o'clock and it's the first Thursday of the month. So we are not going to waste a moment. My name is Ebony, and we've got some of our team on the line here. Do you want to say hello?
Hey, I'll go. This is Marty. Pleasure to meet everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Hey, and we see some other folks who are friendlies on there. Hey, Will, good to see you. Will Tyler.
Good to see you, Miss Ebony. And
Yeah.
good to be here with everybody.
All right. So yeah, we aren't going to waste any time. Like I said, we have Kirsten Woods with us on the line. And Kirsten is a municipal bonds lawyer and stakeholder with the DC municipal bonds program. And, Kirsten, don't let me mess up your title because you do a lot of things. You're a lawyer that does a lot of things and wears a lot of hats. So, we won't, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself too and what you do. And do you have any housekeeping rules that you would like us to follow as far as asking you questions and whatnot?
No, I mean, it seems like we have a pretty manageable group here. So I'm totally open to, having this be conversational. I mean, certainly I could drone on about exactly what I do without interruption. So I can do that, but I'm fine with, being interrupted. If you guys want to just use the hand raise feature, then I can, see that somebody's raising their hand, and then I can call on that person to ask whatever question that they have. I don't think we need to wait until the end or reserve questions till the end. So just feel free to jump in as I'm, as I said, getting on my soapbox and droning on about what I do day to day. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is if there's anything that I say that where I'm like using lingo that doesn't make sense to you all, or you're like, I have no idea what she just said. No problem with, having you pipe in and be like, what does X, Y, and Z mean? Or like, what did you mean by this term? I, do have conversations relatively frequently with people who are not necessarily directly in my industry. So I feel like I'm generally pretty good at trying to explain things in a way that's not super, super technical. But if I do go down that road, someone raise their hand and interrupt me, and I can repeat it in a different way that, is more digestible. So no fear in doing that either. All right, so I'll just go ahead and get started. I know we have 27 minutes from this moment. And I guess I will also start by apologizing if you hear a tiny voice in the background. I have a 1-year-old who is going to be eager for me to start getting her ready for bed after this is over. So if you hear that in the background, I apologize in advance. She is in another place, but for such a tiny body, they sometimes have very big voices. Okay, so as Ebony said, my name is Kirsten Woods, and I'm a shareholder with the law firm of Bryant Miller Olive. We are a boutique law firm specializing primarily in municipal finance, which basically means debt to finance government infrastructure projects. And that kind of comes in a couple of forms. And again, interrupt me if I'm getting, too like specific on this, because I know you already talked to Will a little bit.
Well, you know what? And here's the thing. So if you wouldn't mind going back, and we have a 1-pager that we can pull up, just to kind of set the tone, because we do this every month. But some of these people, I don't think were on the call with Will, or the people who tune in and see this on YouTube might not know anything about the revenue bond program. So I don't know to what degree you're able to speak to the DC revenue. It's actually called the DC Industrial Revenue Bond Program that Will handles. But, that would be wonderful if we could take a step back and talk about something that actually really exists, and then how you might be able to help us implement something like that.
So that's exactly what I was going to talk about, is just some sort of like basics about what this really is. And then we can kind of get into some more specifics for a few minutes as well. So I'll kind of give you the canned, like really simple version of this. Obviously, like I said, there's a ton more detail that could be added to this. 30 minutes is like a drop in the bucket. But I think, you know, it'll be good enough to introduce you all to the tool. And then, you know, to the extent that you have something that could be financed, maybe you'll say, hey, I wonder if this can be financed with this tool. And then you could reach out to me or Will, and we could expand, you know, investigate whether or not what you're trying to do is eligible. So, so as I said, I'm a municipal bond lawyer. I work for an outside law firm. Most of my clients are either governments themselves, or developers or banks. And we can talk a little bit about what those roles are in the transaction. So essentially what I do, what the transactions that I work on do is they provide debt to finance infrastructure that serves a public purpose. And like I was going to say, that kind of comes in two forms. And this is very, again, this is like very, very bare bones explanation. There are details to what I'm saying that, you know, have to be evaluated on a case by case basis. So take what I'm saying as the very, you know, highest level of explanation of what I'm talking about. And then if you had a project where you said, hey, I wonder if I could do this as part of my financing structure, we would really have to look at the specifics of your project and make a determination. So the two types of projects that can be financed with tax exempt bonds that are considered to be infrastructure for public purposes are generally sort of government owned and operated infrastructure. So you'd be talking about K-12 schools. You'd be talking about toll roads. You could talk about water and sewer projects, convention centers, public housing, stadiums. So there's all these things, parks and recreation, all these infrastructure things that are owned, operated, and sort of offered to constituents and residents by governmental entities. And when I say governmental entities, we're mostly talking about state and local governments, not federal government. And then the second sort of prong to that is what we call private activity. So this is a certain bucket of projects that might be privately owned, but are considered by the federal government to provide some sort of public purpose. Things like that would be 501c3 infrastructure. Most common would definitely be college and university financing. So private colleges and universities, they're 501c3 nonprofits. They're able to finance all of their on-campus and educational infrastructure with tax-exempt bonds. And then another big example of that would be affordable housing that's privately owned by a developer, but has affordable set-asides to, you know, limit the income of the tenants who are able to occupy a certain percentage of the projects. So you kind of have those two areas. You will find that there are certain lawyers who focus very specifically maybe in one area. For me, I am a municipal finance generalist. I'll do, you know, anything from airports to private activity, affordable housing. So everything across the board, and my clients kind of reflect that. So essentially what tax exempt bond financing is in general is essentially statutorily, the IRS has said, you know, governments deserve this, you know, benefit of tax exempt financing. And then again, they've sort of designated a few other areas that might be privately owned to be able to benefit from this tax exempt financing. The benefit of tax exempt financing, and disclaimer, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm a lawyer. So this is like the very surface explanation of like what the benefit is and how this works from kind of a business perspective. But essentially, tax exempt rates are lower than your standard commercial, or what we would refer to in our industry as taxable rates. So these would be rates, you know, similar to rates that you would get from like a mortgage broker or something on your mortgage, or maybe even a better analogy would be like a commercial loan that you would just go out and take from a bank. And so the benefit essentially is that a bond is issued by the state or local government. So let's use DC as an example, the revenue bond program. They would issue a bond, and the bond is actually issued by the District of Columbia. So when you see the bond form, the obligor on the bond form is the District of Columbia itself. They issue that bond. There's two ways that the capital can be raised to fund that bond. One is either going to be through a public offering. So this is going to be when the district goes, out into the market and offers these bonds for purchase. And then the second way is going to be through a private placement. And this is where there's actually a negotiated deal between, for example, a bank and the district to actually purchase that bond. And so that's how the capital is going to be raised. One of those two ways in a conduit financing. So there's two kind of ways that these funds can get into a project. On the governmental side, which is not as relevant to you all, the district itself is actually issuing bonds. And then they are taking those proceeds and they are putting those debt proceeds into infrastructure improvements themselves, right? So these are government-owned infrastructure. Again, these are governmental bonds, governmental-owned infrastructure. So you have sort of the district issuing the bonds, taking the cash in, and then the district directly spending that on its own infrastructure needs. On the private activity side, we have a structure that we refer to as a conduit structure. And this is where, because the IRS has said, hey, there are some of these private projects, privately owned projects that actually do serve a public purpose, such as affordable housing or 501c3 purposes. We feel like these private entities do stand to benefit from tax exempt financing, even though statutorily they're not entitled to it. So what happens there is we do what's called a conduit structure. The district still has to issue the bond, and then they will sell the bond either in a public offering or through a private placement. They will take those proceeds, and then the district will loan those proceeds forward to the borrower, who is going to be that private entity of some sort. So the 501c3, or the another one is small manufacturing. So the small manufacturer, the ultimate user and owner of the eligible project, who is then going to be not a governmental entity. And so that's how we get the tax exempt benefit, which is statutorily really only technically available to the government. We get that through to a private user to apply to public projects that are designated as serving a public purpose. And that's more what we're focusing on here. So the Industrial Development Revenue Bond Program is the district's conduit issuer. It's the district's conduit program where they are issuing those bonds and they're able to pass that tax exempt benefit onto these private entities who are serving a public purpose. And you can see on this information sheet that William provided, they have a list of sort of different types of private activities that might benefit from tax exempt bonds. And so, they've got examples: elementary, secondary, college and university facilities, healthcare and health facilities, housing and hotels, industrial development, manufacturing, et cetera, right? So the benefit, the reason why you would want to do tax exempt bond financing if you're able to is because tax exempt rates are typically lower than your standard commercial rate. And that's what I was heading in that direction a couple of minutes ago. So you're getting sort of like an interest rate break on your financing, on that portion of your financing. The reason why a tax exempt rate is less than a standard commercial taxable rate is because when tax exempt bonds are issued by governments, the purchaser of that bond, the holder of it, so that could be you or me or some kind of corporation who decides that's what they want to invest in. If you guys have any investment portfolios, even if it's mutual funds, a portion of that is probably in some kind of governmental bonds because it's a very safe investment vehicle. So the holder of that bond does not have to declare the interest that it receives on the repayment of that bond as taxable income. So I want to buy a tax-exempt bond as an individual person because I can make money on it, but I don't have to be taxed on it. So therefore, for example, if I'm buying a bond that has an interest rate of 5%, then I'm actually pocketing 5%. Whereas if I buy a taxable bond and the interest rate is 5%, and this is just by way of example, if if my tax rate is, if I'm in the 25% tax bracket, then effectively I'm only getting like 4.75% return on that because I'm paying 1.25% to the federal government because I have to declare it as income, right? And so since the holder is not actually having tax liability, then they're willing to take a lower rate. And then that lower rate gets paid forward to the actual developer. And so that's why tax exempt rates are lower than taxable rates, and why if you're eligible to finance with tax exempt financing, you might want to investigate it. So that's sort of the baseline explanation of what tax exempt financing is, why someone would want to use it. Anybody have questions for now? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have one question. This is Pratish.
No problem.
Yeah. Are these federally exempt also? I mean, from federal taxation? And I guess they are, right? So that if I'm a Virginia resident or somebody who's not in DC invests in these bonds, then it's all tax exempt?
Right. So the concept of tax exempt bonds, when we say tax exempt bonds, we're generally talking about exempt from federal taxation. So all of this is grounded in IRS rules and regulations. So the federal IRS rules and regulations. Now, most of the time, if you are a state resident, you can also get tax exemption from your state taxes on those as well. That sort of varies from state to state in terms of whether or not you have to be a resident to get that benefit or whether or not anybody can, get tax exemption from it. So it depends on what the state's rule is in terms of whether or not they would give you some tax exempt benefit from holding a bond from another state. Most of the time, you're going to have to hold a bond from that state in order to get the benefit from state taxes. And then because of that, you would also have to be a resident of that state. So it benefits you most of the time as a bond holder to purchase bonds from the state that you live in because you're getting a tax exempt benefit most of the time in that state too. But all of this is originally derived from federal rules and regulations. So we're talking federal tax exemption.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions before I kind of move on to a few more specifics? Okay. So I'm not gonna delve super deep into the revenue bond program because Will did talk about that, although I know that some of you were not on the line. This is actually a pretty good information sheet that he provided. And as I described, the revenue bond program is available to 501c3 organizations. It's also available to small manufacturers. And what that means, again, we would have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But for your purposes, just keep in mind, this is a potential tool to use if you have a 501c3 borrower who's trying to do a project that is within its 501c3 nonprofit purpose. Or a lot of what we are also able to do and what is considered to be within its nonprofit purpose would be even, for example, a headquarters for that 501c3. So you're able to use it for that as well. And that's probably in the district and really nationwide, probably the most common use of the revenue bonds, the industrial revenue bonds, is for 501c3 financings. And you can see that there's some pretty large and very common 501c3s that are continuously using this tool. What I want to focus on a little bit for the remainder of the time is what we call 142D bonds. 142D is the section of the Internal Revenue Code that covers bonds that are eligible to be used for affordable housing financing. And so I'm gonna just touch on that for like the last 10 minutes, and please feel free to jump in if you've got questions about this. So 142D is the section of the Internal Revenue Code that says that you can use tax-exempt private activity bonds for the purpose of financing affordable housing. Now, the interesting thing about 142D bonds is that if you finance at least 50% of the costs, the eligible costs of your project, so this is probably going to be like eligible basis, right, of your project with these tax-exempt 142D bonds, then you are automatically entitled to 4% low-income housing tax credits. So there's two types of tax credits that are available, low-income housing tax credits that are available. One is the 4% tax credit. We call that an automatic tax credit. And then there's the 9% tax credit, which is a competitive tax credit. The reason why we call it that is because the 9% credits are allocated by the federal government to each state and the District of Columbia on an annual basis based on per capita population, essentially. And so there's a limited amount of 9% credits that are available on an annual basis to finance projects. And so DHCD administers those in the district, and they have a competitive process to evaluate applications that come in for the use of 9% credits. And there's a very small percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, of projects that are actually getting 9% credits to use on an annual basis. So it's an oversubscribed tool. Somebody asking a question? Okay. With respect to 4% credits, those are great because as long as you're financing at least 50% of the cost of your project with tax-exempt 142D bonds, you're entitled to those 4% low-income housing tax credits on an unlimited basis. So the caveat to that is the 501c3 bonds that we talked about, the industrial revenue bonds, those don't require any allocation from the federal government in order to issue them. So you can really issue those on an unlimited basis every single year. With 142D bonds, you actually do have this thing called volume cap, and that's another thing that's allocated from the federal government to each of the states and the district on an annual basis, usually based on population, that says you have this, you can issue this much volume of private activity bonds in a year. And when you issue the 142D bonds, you are issuing it under that volume cap and you're using it up. So there's a limited amount of tax-exempt bonds that can be issued in the affordable housing context based on this volume cap that is, provided and allocated by the federal government. But if you are receiving 142D bond authority from the district, then you're automatically entitled to the 4% tax credits. That's a beautiful thing because what we're able to do on the tax credit side of the transaction is essentially commoditize those tax credits. So where the project borrower would be entitled to take these tax credits on a year-over-year basis as long as they're meeting the required set-asides under the affordable housing regulations for Section 142D, then they can actually take that right to receive those credits over a period of time and sell that to somebody who wants to benefit from those tax credits. And in that way, they're able to generate cash up front to go into the project, be a part of the capital stack, and actually complete the project. So whereas, you know, the initial vision of the tax credits was that on an annual basis, these projects, the owners of these projects would be entitled to reduction in taxes on an annual basis. Many, many years ago, they came up with a structure that said, well, you know, maybe there are some for-profit entities that could really benefit from these tax credits more than us and would be willing to pay us up front for that benefit. And then that way we can actually use that as equity into the project. So when you see affordable housing projects, there's typically going to be a capital stack that includes about 51% of your 142D tax exempt bonds, because of volume cap, most governmental entities are not going to want to finance more than that. They can, but they want to spread the love around. So they will give you basically the minimum amount that you need in order to trigger those tax credits. So let's say you get 51% in tax exempt bonds. So you're doing 51% in tax exempt debt. Then you're going to have your low income housing tax credit equity, because you're able to take the tax credits that you're generating, commoditize those, bring that cash in and use that for construction. And then you're probably going to have some kind of still gap between the total of your tax credits and your bond debt that's got to be filled in with some type of subordinate financing. A lot of times that is filled in by loans from DHCD through their Housing Production Trust Fund, which I'm sure you've heard of that. Sometimes it is filled in by the developers themselves, making actual loans into the project. And sometimes it's grants. We've seen Amazon now come into the district and make these subordinate loans to help affordable housing projects actually be able to be completed. And so there's a bunch of different potential tools that you could see for gap financing. And that gap is not always filled by one of those tools. It's usually a combination that comes in and fills that gap. So when you see the capital stack for an affordable housing project, it's usually going to be a varied capital stack. Whereas when you look at some of these other project financings, you might only see one or two sources, and that's typically going to be tax exempt debt and then some kind of equity from the borrower or owner. They're coming to the table with some kind of cash, and then that'll be it. But with these affordable housing projects, they're very complex capital stacks. And it's probably a conversation for another day to, you know, talk a little bit about what costs can get paid by what source, because there's a whole thing about that too, right? Because a lot of these sources have really specific limitations on what you can actually pay for from that source, including tax exempt bonds. And so one of the things about tax exempt bonds, and this is true for the 501c3 bonds as well as the 142D bonds, is that 95% of the costs of your project must be financed as good costs. And what good costs means in terms of eligible costs, again, that's probably a more detailed conversation for another day.
Would you be open to that? Because I mean, we run up against this sometimes, and this is, I think, one of those cases where this is such a robust program and it offers so many amazing things, not just to us as real estate professionals, but also consumers that have businesses. I mean, this is just really, for me at least, just blowing my mind. So
yeah, I mean, we can certainly, you know, have 30 minutes where we talk about something more specific, a more specific slice of the pie rather than looking at it from 30,000 square feet. I'm fine with that, because I mean, it's very complicated, and 30 minutes is just, you know, probably the tip of the iceberg on it. So I think it is 6:30, and I know you guys have only allotted 30 minutes. I can come back and do some follow-up on some more specific things.
We would love it.
I think the one thing that I wanted to, you know, just wrap up with and clarify and add to this sort of, you know, 30,000 square foot view, when you're talking about affordable housing, you do have these set asides that you have to you have these restrictive covenants on the property. So in exchange for getting this tax exemption, getting these low-income housing tax credits, there's restrictions on the property for at least 15 years. And you've got a 40-60 test where at least 40% of the units have to be set aside for residents who have 60% or less of area median income as set by HUD. And then you have a 20-50, which is where at least 20% have to be set aside for residents who, have at least 50% or less of area median income. And you have to be able to meet those tests in order to maintain the tax credits and trigger the tax credits. And then also to maintain the bonds and trigger the bonds. So there's a lot of restrictions on the use of the property that come along with this tax exempt benefit and these tax credits that are going to be available to complete the project. Now, the nice part is it's not 100%, so you can do mixed income projects. The negative part essentially is that you're only able to trigger tax credits for the units that actually are restricted, that actually are income restricted. So the more units you have in the project that are income restricted, the more equity you're able to generate towards the project. So you will see, historically, there's been a lot of 100% affordable projects done for that reason, because it just makes it, number one, you have a lot of developers that do this exclusively, like that's the mission of their organization. But then also you generate a ton more equity into the project and reduce that gap a lot more if you're doing 100% affordable than you do if you're doing less. And then the other thing is, more recently, we have seen more sort of mixed income where there's more standard commercial developers who are trying to make use of the tax exempt bonds. And so you do have more projects that are now coming through where you might have, sort of closer to that, 40 or 20% set aside or something, maybe more than that, but less than 100%. Especially, now that a lot of jurisdictions are sort of requiring these inclusionary zoning things. So they're requiring market rate developers to include affordable pieces into their project. So if they can design their project where they can meet, the local requirements, but also meet the IRS set aside requirements and trigger these tax credits, then, that's kind of a win-win for them as well, since they have to kind of do it anyway. And so I think we are seeing sort of more mixed income projects than we have historically, where you see market rate mixed with, the affordable. And I think that's, sort of the current perspective on things as well. You don't want to segregate people by income. You want people to live, harmoniously side by side. And you don't want people to walk by and say, oh, that's an affordable unit. So, there's a lot more mixed income going on, which I'm sure you guys know. So anyway, I wanted to just close with that because I think that's an important thing to understand with respect to the affordable housing bonds and the 30,000 square foot view. And I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can reconvene another time. Any questions before I go? No, nothing? Surprising.
Oh,
Just one real quick. So just on that last piece that you said, so is that your role, helping these, I guess, commercial or these developers put these pieces of the puzzle together to make sure that they're getting these credits, that they have the proper amount of affordable housing units and so forth? Is that your role, to bring all that together for them?
So my role, again, disclaimer, I am not the business person, right? So when you bring these teams together, it's usually a ton of lawyers, financial people, development people, all coming together to the table to make all of this work. And so I will mention that as a piggyback to that question, which is that the cost of financing for something like this is certainly greater than a traditional commercial loan, right? So you're paying more upfront in terms of issuance costs because you need a lot more professionals at the table than just going to a bank and they're like, here's our standard form loan agreement. like take it or leave it, and here's your interest rate, and you know, we're going to amortize it in equal monthly installments over the next 30 years. Peace out, we'll see you later. It's not that simple because there's a lot of compliance things that are surrounding this, so that the upfront cost is certainly more expensive. And so a financial advisor will have to look at the transaction and say, okay, here's how much it's going to cost to actually get this transaction done, but here's how much you're going to save over the life of the loan by using a tax exempt rate instead of a taxable rate, by getting these tax credits versus not getting these tax credits. And so to offset that, here's the actual financial benefit, right? And so the answer is, I am part of the team that does that, but I'm not the only person who does it. There's a ton of structuring that goes into this from a financial development and legal side of things. And so, you know, typically for me, when I'm representing developers, I am brought on very early in the process, because as they're building that capital stack and deciding how they want to finance things, they're also looking at the project and saying, what portions of this project are financeable with a particular tool, right? Especially now that so many mixed use, not just mixed income, but mixed use projects are being done, where you might have a retail component and a residential component, and then that residential component might have market rate and affordable. So, you know, I am usually brought in pretty early. I mean, I have been brought in on projects by developers that haven't closed for 3 years because, you know, I'm brought in at the beginning of the design process. Like, they have a concept, they have an idea, they may have acquired a building, but they're gelling the concept and trying to figure out, you know, what is and is not financeable by certain things. But it's a team of people that really have to do that, because I think there's a legal piece, a legal compliance piece, and then there's also a business desire piece. And then there's also other legal compliance things that are outside of my purview, which are like real estate type things, you know, zoning, permits, like all of that kind of stuff. And if you're talking about affordable housing, you may have like tenant opportunity to purchase compliance things, which are outside of my purview. So I'm usually working alongside other lawyers and other financial people and development people, experts, and we're pooling all of our expertise to come up with the best solution for that particular client and that particular project. Okay.
Okay, great. I have one question. This is Pratish. Yeah, in general, actually, it's initially also for Ebony. Ebony, my apologies in advance because I missed the first, revenue bond session that you had organized. But I was just wondering what your vision of this is for us real estate agents. I'm thinking it's something along the lines of having investors who are interested in, greenfield investment in various parts of the district, so that then they can avail themselves of some of these benefits of these DC programs. And the question is then, how would we make money as realtors? That's my first question.
Well, I mean, I think you have to figure that out along the lines of, you know, what the project is, what you're trying to do. Does it deal with housing? You know, and not only that, you know, though we're realtors, we own businesses ourselves. So, you know, I think that perhaps maybe think a little bigger than, you know, doing this for somebody else, and, you know, perhaps looking at doing something, you know, on your own accord to try and use the bond program. That's for the Bates International Group. That's what we're looking at.
Okay, great. And also for the attorney, the question I have is if I mean, are there, to your knowledge, Madam, are there projects that the DC government has sort of like got on the, you know, on the back burner or front burner, where they would like to invite investment, including from overseas, by developers for any number of things? Could be new school, or, you know, mixed use, or affordable housing, because I know the affordable housing is big on the mayor's list of things.
Yeah, affordable housing is definitely a priority for the mayor, but those questions are outside of my purview. I am, you know, I'm a contractor for the district basically, so that is definitely like outside of my purview. I mean, I can tell you that they've done projects that have had foreign investment, and you know, they have supported projects that have, you know, foreign investment, and they have, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of proposals every year, for various types of projects throughout the city, not just housing, but, you know, a ton of other things. So, you know, the specifics of that, I can't really answer, but
it's okay. And the thing
Yeah,
is,
that's fine.
you've done beautifully in answering the question. And I think, Pratish, you know, we're definitely going to have you back, Kirsten, you know, and I apologize that we've gone over, but you would approach that probably in the organizational structure, Pratish, as far as who is a part of the 501c3 and if those are foreign investors or not. I don't know that matters. But anyways, we can talk about that offline and talk shop as realtors. But I want to thank everybody for coming. We're going to be back starting September off right, the 1st of September. So we'll definitely be talking with Kirsten about when she can come back, her schedule provided, but we'll certainly be back. And if anybody who is on the line knows that it's the same link, same time, and we'll see you back here next month. Thank you.